Can I welcome you all this evening? Firstly, it's really fantastic to see so many people here this evening to listen to Jagjit. It really is. It's a testament, Jagjit, to all the work you've done over so many years and the love in which you are held by very many people. Even, I hope that's still true after you've spoken this evening, but let's assume it now. I also just want to take a moment to advertise Jagjit's book, published a couple of years ago, The Money Minders, The Parables, Trade-offs and Lags of Central Banking. And it's available outside at the end. It's an honour to me to chair this event this evening. My name is Charles Clarke. I've had a life in politics. I did an undergraduate degree here, first in maths and then economics, and I've always been very interested in the way that Jagjit talks about these things. He's asked me to various events which he's been involved in, mainly at the National Institute for Social Research, which he directed with such distinction over so long. And I think he has a tremendous capacity to bring to life some of these immensely complicated and difficult problems which exist for anybody who's trying to manage an economy in any given way. And so that's the reason I'm very much looking forward to what he is going to say this evening. The subject of his talk this evening, Booms, Busts and Blunders, the UK's Economic Journey and Policy Pitfalls, 1990 to 2024, will take us through that journey. I assume, Jagjit, that you don't think that these booms, busts and blunders started in 1990, but there were a few before that in previous circumstances. But we very much are looking forward to what you have to say. The structure of the event this evening is that Jagjit's going to talk probably for about 40-50 minutes and set out his talk. I'll then ask him a couple of questions and then we'll throw it open to the floor. We're scheduled to finish at 6:30 and I hope we have a very full discussion then. So Jagjit, very big congratulations on all of these things and we look forward to hearing you now.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you very much. Thank you, Charles. I'm not sure I recognise myself when Charles talks about me, which is probably a good thing. I'm very grateful to the Faculty of Economics and many colleagues for asking me to give this lecture today, and colleagues at the University of Cambridge, but more generally from all the people I have learnt as an economist over the years. It's a learning process. Don't ever think that economists are minted at the day they're born or after their first degree. It is an everlasting process of learning about the economy. It's not something that springs into life in one day. I've learned so much in my career and I'm thankful to so many people who helped me along the way. And I think Charles, if I may say something in return, exemplifies why I remain positive about the British economy. A very senior policymaker who couldn't be here today because he was busy not changing interest rates. Yes, very hard work, if you can get it, very hard work. Wrote to me in an email and said, I'd love to be there, but I'm sure it's going to be very depressing stuff. I said, well, not really. I'm filled with hope. I think there are high quality people in this country. If I may say so, Charles exemplifies that, but we see them across the political spectrum. We see them in government, we see them in policy. Heaven forfend, we see them at the University of Cambridge. And we have many possibilities for this country to do better than it has done. But where we have to start with is an honest and decent appraisal of where we are. And I'm afraid what we get too little of in the media, in the press, and in general conversation is that hard-nosed analysis of where the country is, whether we're happy with it, and what we can do to improve our outcomes. To be honest, there's too much ephemera. I think sometimes people are just not serious enough about the problems we face as a country. So I want to spend much of this lecture today going through the problems that we face. But I want to end with some hope that I do believe there is a possibility of a better future. I was reminded this morning that it's 50 years today since Harold Wilson resigned as Prime Minister in 1976. And I'm sorry to say I'm old enough to remember that. Yes, I know, it's a terrible thing. Not his resignation, but my memory of it, and the maelstrom of the political economy situation that engulfed the country for much of the next decade, I think is instructive to someone like me in those formative years of my own life. Now, before going headlong into the lecture, I just want to spend a minute, if I may, mentioning the excellent work of the anti-Nolan Stem Cell Register, which is wonderful work supporting people who need stem cells, helping people decide to join the register, but also broadly supporting what stem cell donation can do for people, not only the person receiving, but also the person giving. The sense of being able to change or save someone's life is a wonderful feeling. So I'm not going to stand here and proselytize their work particularly, but Eddie Henry from the register is here this evening outside with pamphlets and bump, and I would ask you, I think Eddie here, do you want to just stand up and say hello? Or, here he is, very good looking young man. Stand up and give you some information so you can make a considered decision about how and whether you support their quite excellent work. So Eddie, thank you for coming, and thank you for all the good work that the Anti-Nolan Stem Cell Register does for so many people around the world. Thank you. Now, I want to just sort of start with a personal anecdote, if I may. Those of you know this is a view from the Royal Exchange Square looking across the road to the Bank of England. And this photograph was taken on September the 16th, 1992, when the UK fell out of the European exchange rate mechanism that evening. In fact, if this camera had an X-ray lens, it would note that I was actually in the Bank of England that morning, with such as my ability to trigger crises. Signing a contract to start work there shortly there afterwards. And I came out, went back to the LSE where I was writing my dissertation, and we were enjoying the movement up in interest rates and the scandal and the crisis that was occurring because we weren't involved, we were just watching it. And I remember someone coming into the computer room saying, I know who it was, but I won't mention his name because he's very well known, came and said, rates have now gone up to 15%. And I don't know where this came from. I said, no, they won't stay there. That's the end of the ERM. There was just no way that the British economy at that time could have withstood such high interest rates. And of course, later on that evening, Norman Lamont came out of the Treasury and announced our exit from the European exchange rate mechanism. You may have seen that wonderful photo with him at the front, with David Cameron standing just behind him, looking sheepish, as he has for most of his career, I think. And may I also say, for very good reason. But my point here is also to say this is how we used to find out about information. Word of mouth. What was on the billboards of the Evening Standard. We were not all tied to our mobile phones all day long, but somehow or other, information got around. We knew what was happening. And it's incredibly interesting to me that we knew then what was going on. We formed our views, we formed our opinions, without having to ask Google or ask our phones or ask our friends. And I think we might have lost something in that period, our own ability to form judgments. And that might come back to haunt us in some way or other. But anyway, I thought this was a great photo explaining how things used to happen. And remember, I was a few pillars behind there signing papers to join the bank. So what's my contention? What's the story that I'm trying to sell to you today? That's when I start to sound like an economist, and I apologise for that. I think the UK has been subject, and I've lived through them as an adult, regular and damaging economic crises. Stephen Broadberry at Oxford calls them disruptions to economic growth. Good friend and a quite excellent economic historian. When we look back over time, they're there. The 1990-1992 ERM, those of us of a certain age remember that we joined at too high an exchange rate. In order to keep that exchange rate constant with the Deutschmark, we had to raise interest rates to a level that were not consistent with internal balance, by which I mean it triggered too much unemployment and too low a rate of inflation. It was therefore not a credible path for interest rates. And the markets realised that and started to sell sterling accordingly. high interest rates at the time triggered bankruptcies, negative equities, and people losing their houses. So it had definite social consequences with a blunder of joining the ERM at that time and not recognizing that you could actually have price stability domestically with a credible, independent central bank. You didn't have to tie your monetary policy to an overseas agent, even if that agent was German. And I think that's the first blunder and the first crisis that I want to mention to you. And then we got this long period of globalization with the world economy opening up, financialization, trade with the rest of the world, this remarkable feat of pulling many poor countries out of poverty, 1 billion or so people pulled out of poverty over this long period. But trade, of course, threatened the domestic production of goods and services. So you get this result in economic theory that trade is a good thing, allows people to specialize, promotes higher levels of growth, but it can obviously in the short run be damaging to domestic producers who suddenly find themselves subject to overseas competition. And the right way to deal with that is to think of forms of compensation, whether it means direct wage compensation or the building of an infrastructure that allows different industries to develop, would have been a much better solution than just saying to those parts of the country, and I take this completely out of context, just get on your bike and find a job. It's not as simple as that. Need ways and mechanisms to build employment where it has been lost. And we felt as a country, and I'm as guilty as anyone else, that it was sufficient to tie ourselves to the financial sector, which was accounting, depending on different measures, and other people have different views, of some 8 to 12% of GVA, gross value added, the sort of output of the economy. And if we add in other accountancy services and legal services, you can get to a number of 18% or higher. But the problem there was it didn't lead to a balanced economy, very much centred in London and the southeast, and certainly, as we can observe over the longer secular run, didn't have phrase coming up that those of us may remember who lived in the 1980s, didn't have trickle down. No obvious evidence that the increase in incomes and wealth triggered by the financial sector and the high value service sector spilled over to other parts of the economy, meaning, another phrase coming up that you would have heard about as well, that large parts of the economy were left behind because they were not able to access the higher levels of income that the high value service sector was generating in some parts of the country. And the financial crisis itself was the result of an overemphasis on financialization, a lack of regulation of the banking sector, and overextending borrowing, particularly towards property. We know all of this, and the financial crisis itself could have been averted with better regulation of the financial system. The tripartite system between the FSA, the Bank of England, and the Treasury did not work particularly well. It's very clear from Alistair Darling's wonderfully written autobiography. It didn't work, but as a consequence, to stop the financial system falling over, we started to take on large amounts of public debt to provide a backstop for the financial sector. And the response to that is something we're still living with. Escalating levels of public debt and the notion that every time there's a problem, politicians can just borrow more money to sort it out. Actually, it's not always the answer. And I'll come to that a little bit later on. Sorry, I've got to keep drinking water. And then 2016 to 2020 were what I call the Brexit wars. I became director of the National Institute in May 2016, not really realizing, that's how stupid I was, I continue to be stupid, that there was a referendum brewing 6 weeks later. And the first thing I had to do was present the National Institute's forecast of what would happen if we decided to leave the European Union to the world's press. I'd never done a press conference before. I'd never presented a forecast before. And I found myself in a room having to explain what would happen to the economy. And fortunately, we got it right. We said productivity would suffer, investment would fall, and the economy would likely enter the doldrums for a generation. Now, we never said there'd be a recession. We never said there'd be an 8% hit to output. We simply said the economy will go into slow motion for a while as we adjust ourselves to our new trading regime and think about how we can trigger investment in the economy. In fact, I wrote a letter at that time with the then director of the Centre for Economic Performance and the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, saying exactly this. And what grated in the next couple of years was dealing with the media narrative that the economists had got it wrong. It was particularly annoying because we got it damn right. We said exactly how it would happen. And one of the problems I discovered when talking to the media is that there seemed to be a false balance being pursued. What you needed was, for every one person who said it was a good idea, they needed someone who said it was a bad idea. So my dear friend Patrick Minford found himself, and he's quite a funny guy, on media permanently explaining why leaving the European Union was an excellent idea, rather than the media deciding, look, what's the centre of gravity here? What does the science say? Well, the science says it's probably likely to damage the economy. So let's figure that as a central point and then have discussions about the risks to that view on one side or the other. That was not done. And I think skewed the debate subsequently. And it made it very hard for experts, of whom we've had enough, to get the point home that we needed to do something under these circumstances to support investment, private and public, to support education, to support all the structural factors that would help the economy deal with the shock of leaving the European Union and the endemic uncertainty created by not knowing where we were about to go. You'll recall that having called the referendum, our erstwhile Prime Minister, David Cameron, just left from stage right. Didn't manage the process at all. Of course, what you ought to have done is said, right, we listened to what the advisory referendum has said. What we'll do is go away for 2 years and work out what the best way of achieving this is, and then we'll have a debate in 2 years' time as to how to do it, or potentially a discussion in Parliament. But that didn't happen. What we had was an absolute mess. The National Institute, I should say, is in Smith Square, right in the middle of Whitehall, and I think I aged about 10 years in 6 months at that time, trying to make these points, particularly to the Department for leaving the European Union. But I ought to guard some element of the conversations I had, at least at this stage. And my point is not so much the damage caused by leaving the European Union or the uncertainty then caused. But I believe watching this exhausted public policymakers. It left them tired, in a spin, not knowing which way to take the country. And by bad luck or design or deus ex machina, COVID struck, just at the time at which we were least able to deal with this, it seemed to me. Such was the level of exhaustion that I came across with policymakers and others at this time in February, March 2020, if you recall, that terrible period. As an institute, we ensured that everyone can work at home, and we sent people home with bits of kit so they could do so, and we started projecting our work on our forecasts from home at that time. But the COVID crisis was an awful period. Hundreds of thousands of people died. We didn't manage the economy very well at that time. And I got involved in many debates where there was felt to be a trade-off between the economy and health. And I think I lost my voice on various occasions saying there is no long-run trade-off. If people don't think they're well, they're not going to go to work, they're not going to spend money, they're going to stay at home. It's absolutely critical that we safeguard the nation's health before we do anything else. Again, I have to be careful what I say, but you'd be shocked at the number of politicians and Secretary of States who were persuaded by the alternate argument that keeping business going was more important than looking after the health of the nation. I learned a lot at that time, a lot that I didn't want to learn, but I learned something about the priorities that many of our leaders have. The economy seems to me, looking at it over this long time, has structural failures. Let me sort of define what I mean by structural. Vocational education failures, communication, whether through broadband, structural failures in policy, which I can talk about for the rest of my life if required, far too loose monetary policy, too tight fiscal policy, and an over-centralised policy-making framework. So these are just some of the structural failures that I don't think will be new to people in this room. But they were so obvious during the period that I was running the National Institute, I think it's necessary to write them and spit them out again. Supply side rigidities. And what we mean by the supply side is the ability of the economy to supply goods and services in response to shocks. Can it adapt and re-employ its labour and its capital and its productivity in order to continue to produce in an efficient manner? That's essentially what we mean by supply side. But we're full of rigidities as an economy. We haven't properly reformed. Whether it's transport. Has anyone tried to take a train to Manchester from Cambridge? Don't. Even if you're going to Old Trafford, which I would never advise you going to anyway, as a Yorkshireman. Housing. Continually promise we'll build more housing to make mobility more flexible, make housing more affordable, and allow people to start their lives in their own place. Doesn't seem to happen. Domestic finance, whether we go back to the Macmillan Committee of 1930 or any other analysis, our system of domestic finance leaves a lot to be required. Very, very hard for people to get finance, to start firms and grow them in the way that you would want. In a place like Cambridge, where there are venture capitalists and all ways of raising money, let me remind you what's commonly known as the 90-mile limit on these things. If you're more than 90 miles outside of London, forget about it. It's not going to happen. They won't go up to Oldham. They won't go up to Bradford. They just won't go outside of that 90-mile radius. So remember that when you're setting up your business and you're trying to make billions in IP, make sure you're within 90 miles of London. Lack of economic diversification. Of course, we have world-leading industries, universities, pharma, finance, IT. But we don't have world-leading across the board, and we're overemphasized in many areas that have low levels of productivity. Hospitality, retail, restaurants, all these areas are things that we do a lot, but they're not terribly productive, and they don't generate high wages and areas of local demand. And this leads to the problem that we see of regional and household inequality. If you're not haven't had the benefit of a good education, whatever that may mean, and all the qualities that brings to you in order to access high quality service sector jobs, you're then demoted to work in these low wage areas. It doesn't generate sufficient demand in economies. So what we see in the UK is typically in other countries, cities are productive places. But our cities, second, third and fourth tier cities, are not productive in the same way at all. Haven't got centres of demand that are strong enough outside of London, arguably Manchester, sticks in the craw for me to say that as a Yorkshireman, arguably Manchester, possibly Glasgow, but there are not enough of them, dynamic, productive cities where people can establish their lives and work and receive high wages in return that would generate local levels of demand, high employment, and address regional imbalances. And what we see as a result of these structural failures is that we're more prone to crises, and we end up in an economy and a set of policymakers that are generally in the mode of short-term crisis management. Apparently there's a war going on in the Gulf. So now we think about sending ships out there. And now we think about what to do about oil supply. Why were we not thinking about these things 10 or 15 years ago? Why were we not gaming the possibility of this war? It's an awful thing, war. This war is awful as well. But to anyone who's been following events, it's not a surprise. It's shocking, but not a surprise. I hope you follow the difference between the two. And a well-governed and planned country with good levels of administration would have worked this out and put in contingency plans. Oh no, we're shocked again. We're surprised once again, and what we have to do from the back of the Treasury sofa is find £53 million to help those poor people who haven't got enough heating oil or can't afford to pay for it. This happens every time there's a crisis in this country. Let's take the long view, and then I'm going to apologise because I'm going to hit you with some charts. That's what economists do, okay? Dentists will drill you. We hit you with charts, okay? So it's not physically painful. So what's happened over our period? The CPI index just measures as an index the costs of goods and services that we're buying. And we can see that not quite, the CPI index has not quite tripled from 1990 to 2026, but it implies an average annual inflation rate of just over 2.5%. So broadly speaking, price stability. I know the Bank of England's target is now 2%, but that was only brought in around 2001. It's not far off 2.5%. It's what we mean by price stability. Prices will drift up, but at the same time, the quality of goods and services is improving. So broadly speaking, we treat that as price stability. Bank rate, the interest rate which banks are lending, or the Bank of England lends to banks that need money, was considerably higher in 1990, pushing 15%. And you can see that's come down over time. I have a chart later on to explain that. And the big driver of that is the reduction in inflation as we attain price stability. But I also want to make the point, actually, bank rate is very easy at the moment. It's not tight. For those of you who think 3.75% are tight, I'm going to surprise you a little bit later on. It's not. Still very loose monetary policy. And I keep annoying friends on the MPC every time I tell them that. Public debt, meanwhile, has exploded. Very manageable, under 30%, if I may say, almost German levels in 1990. And what we see now is that public debt is about the same size as national income at GDP. And if you look at the OBR's forecast from last week, it's going to stay there for the rest of this decade. These are huge levels of debt that impact upon our options, impact upon debt interest service. UK bond yields have gone up to 4.6, 4.7% today. And if we're paying that on 100% of debt, we're paying the best part of 5% GDP just on the interest on the debt that we've got before we do anything else. This is a great concern to those of us who would rather the money was used on other things. Be absolutely clear about that. How about income per head? Well, that's done well, hasn't it? We've gone from about 30,000, this is all in real terms, to about 43,000. Well done. Actually, it's rubbish. 1.1% a year is what it implies. The post-war average, when I say war after World War II, was nearer 2% and slightly. And had we grown at 2%, had we managed our affairs better, our income per head now would be at 58,000. I don't know about you, I wouldn't say no to an extra 16,000 a year. Anybody say no to that? And that would simply result from the better management of this economy. It's an amazing level of free good. Could someone tell the ESRC that next time make an application for funding? It's an amazing difference. So when we say that we're now poorer than the United States, that's almost entirely accounted for by our sclerotic growth over the last 20 years or so. Had we managed our affairs better, we would not feel poorer or inferior to the United States. So what's my argument overall? I think there are 2 points I want to raise. My first boss at the Bank of England was Andrew Crockett, who went off to become General Secretary of the Bank for International Settlements shortly there afterwards, which was useful for me because it enabled me to have lots of nice trips to Basel, particularly during the ski season. But Andrew made an excellent point about risk, which I use regularly when I talk to people about things. And it's not that risk is increasing in a recession and falls in a boom. It's actually that risk is increasing during upswings. Typically during an economic expansion, there are risks somewhere in the system that we have to think hard about as policymakers. And then when they've built up to such a degree, we then get a recession as the economy tries to adjust itself. So what we have to think hard about is what are the risks that are currently building up that we need to act against, not wait until the crisis occurs, that we're in a recession and we're all screaming for something to be done. It's always too late by then. So we need forward-looking policy, careful examination, forensic examination of the state of the economy and economic balances so that we're addressing that. And I'm afraid our policymakers do not generally deliver on these things at all. I know there's some policymakers in the audience. This is not a personal statement. It's about the system and the incentives that evolve inside of it. James Dow, who was Deputy Director of the National Institute in the 60s, made the classic argument against economic fine-tuning. This idea that you haven't controlled things well, because of your previous errors, you now face a bunch of constraints, which means you can't do everything you'd want to do. You're then left with some choices on monetary and fiscal policy that you'll try and enact, but generally you'll get it wrong. And what you'll do is you'll increase the volatility of the economic cycle. And this was his fundamental criticism, what then became known as stop-go in economics, which characterizes the 1970s as well. And I thank James for that insight, and I regularly cite his insight. So this is the charty bit, okay? So just bear with me, everyone. The first thing is, this is dollars per pound sterling. So and for those of you who work in financial markets, you know this is called cable. And all I want to do is make a couple of points here, if I may. I've picked out the crises, and you can see as an open economy, it means we have a high degree of vulnerability to shocks to the rest of the world, and we trade extensively with the rest of the world, so we're a globalised economy. What we typically see is when there's a negative shock to the UK, things that mean our prospects are worse than we thought beforehand, the exchange rate depreciates. That's a way of helping us deal with our exports in the future. And the most obvious way of looking at that is the relationship with the dollar. And you can see a sharp depreciation during the ERM crisis, again in the financial crisis, during the Brexit wars, and during the cost of living. So think of the exchange rate here as generally reflecting relative inflation, but also a move in a direction to help the economy pay its way. If the exchange rate is falling, it's a little bit easier for us to export, a little bit harder for us to import, and it might be easier for us to pay our way. There's some technical considerations that I almost certainly would bore you with, so I won't bore you with them. But generally, that's the way we think about the exchange rate in these circumstances. So good, the exchange rate helps. It's a shock absorber. Well done, exchange rate. But I want to point out, consistent with my story, is that since the financial crisis, the exchange rate has been trending downwards. Now that means that in order to hold our competitive position, the markets have judged that we need a lower exchange rate to support our competitiveness, because overall we're not as competitive as we might otherwise be. That's a problem. Why is it a problem? Because those of you aware that international goods such as oil, gas and food are priced in, come on, this is the feedback bit, dollars. So it leaves us particularly susceptible to volatility in international prices. And what we have is economists called a terms of trade shock. Every time oil prices go up or food prices go up, you remember after the invasion of Ukraine, we suddenly realized that Ukraine was the breadbasket of the world. We didn't know before because we're done, right? Food prices go up, energy prices go up, they're priced in dollars, our exchange rate is depreciating, all of a sudden our inflation rate takes off, and that particularly hits the poorer households I've been talking about. The households who are working in industries where wages are low. How do they meet these fixed costs? With great difficulty. We then get a situation where the government feels it's got to help them. I'm not saying the government shouldn't help them. I'm saying the government feels it has to help, particularly the poorer households in these circumstances. So you get more demand on the fiscal position and public debt cranks up again. In all of that, it's pretty useful that interest rates were low and debt was cheap to issue. I'll come back to that point a little bit later. How about the thing that we think matters? Income per head. This is real income per head, the annual growth rate in the post-war period and then in my period, when I started thinking about economic policy. So I clearly haven't done a great job. But there you go, did my best. I'll go now. But what you can see is, okay, there's a lot of volatility, variance, forgive me, in year-to-year growth rates in national income per head. But I think it's possible, and Oliver will correct me on this, best fit line. You can play with it any way you want. But one can see a declining trend in output growth since 1990. And you've got lower peaks in growth all along the way. You've got this ERM crisis, the financial crisis, and other crises that are just suggesting that our trend rate of growth has been declining over this period. It's still positive for most of that time, so it's still growing, But the point is we're growing less quickly than we are used to, than we might have expected, than we might have thought feasible, and that leads to a general sense of annoyance, frustration, and in some quarters in the country, anger. Why are we doing so badly? Why aren't we doing as well as my parents' generation? Why am I not feeling better over my lifetime? These are questions people are asking. It's a result of the numbers that I'm putting in front of you. And to add to that is the variance. The ERM crisis, the financial crisis. COVID was a terribly difficult time. Output falling by 12% and then coming back again. And the cost of living crisis as well triggered a minor recession in 22, 23. So I'm telling you a story of aggregate income not growing particularly fast on average. But what also matters is the dispersion of it. So I put up here weekly household income for the 12 regions at the nomenclature of territorial units, NUTS 1, as it's called. Someone needs to rethink that name. But what we have is the distribution of the 12 regions in 1994, in 2010, and 2022. The box is the interquartile range. So some of you can study this later on if you don't know this stuff. The line going across in the middle of the box is the median, and the top and the bottom is the top and bottom region. The top region in every case is London. I won't say which the bottom region is. But I think the points here are some growth from 1994 to 2010. If we look at the median, the average growth rate there is about 1.6% in those 16 years from 1994 to 2010. And if we look from 2010 to 2022, at the median, the average annual growth rate is 0.7%. So more than halving of the previous growth rate. So another reason to feel annoyed with outcomes. It's not where we anticipated it being. And at the same time, we can note, increasing asymmetry. And the way we look at that is the distance of the top from the median is growing over time. And that's the income accruing to people in high-value service sector, as opposed to those people who are either still working in manufacturing or in other industries that we find dotted around the country. This is why we need high levels of demand and highly productive industries dotted around the country, so that this asymmetry with higher incomes at the top starts to be offset. I don't think an unbalanced economy is a healthy economy. Similarly, if we look at wealth, country, we can, perhaps not a surprise, to look at the wealth held by the people in the top deciles. It's amazing how little people look at these kinds of numbers. And what we have, one of the ratios we can look at for the distribution is the ratio between the 80th and 20th percentile of the wealth distribution. And that's been somewhere between 23 and 25 over this whole period. So huge ratio of wealth inequality between the people at the 80th percentile and those at the 20th percentile. I make no value judgment about whether that's too high or too low. You'll get a sense of what I think of it. And I also note that the average growth of wealth over this period has been around 3.5% to 4% a year, very much triggered, in my view, by the low interest rate regime we've had in that period. And what's interesting is we see that growth in asset wealth across the board. So whether you've had a low initial level of asset or a high level initial level of asset, there's been a growth of around 3 to 4% in all asset classes, which means that those who are initially well off have done very well over that period because their wealth has grown at 3 to 4% for some 15 years or so. Do the calculation yourself. And that's part of the problem the economy faces, seems to me. We also have a tax and benefit system, which is kind of doing its job. The orange block is the income. There are 5 quintiles here. So we take the 20th, 40th, 60th, 80th, and 100 percentiles. And the orange is the pay original income of people in that quintile. And what colour should we call that on the right? I'm not very good with colours. Anyone help me here? Rust? Did someone say rust? Rust, should we go for rust? Yeah, rust on the right, orange and rust. What we can see is we have a progressive tax system. That the top 20 percentile lose about 27% of their original income with their final income by being taxed. So don't let anyone tell you we haven't got a progressive tax system. What I want to pose is the question is, why are those in the bottom 40% who may be at work and drawing income getting incomes that are so low that they need this level of support in order to lead to subsistence? Now, I'm not saying the government shouldn't support them, don't misunderstand me. I'm saying, why is it we're running an economy where those people who are out working and are getting incomes that places them in the bottom 40th percentile need their incomes upgraded by such a large amount in order to meet subsistence levels? What is wrong with our labour markets and the way that we're paying people such that this level of intervention is required? Were it not required, by which I mean if we had more productive firms, better structured firms, paying people higher salaries, even in the bottom 2 quintiles, we wouldn't need this level of support. And the £320 billion that we're collecting from the top 20% could be used to run down the level of debt. And were it being used to run down the level of debt, we could use that money for public investment that was well targeted. And I'll come to that later on. So we've got a sort of an unbalanced economy as a result of a number of factors here. Low productivity in the low wage areas, the need for government support, and taxes that are allocated to redistribution rather than the growth of financial assets in the public sector. This is the problem that we find ourselves with. And ask another question. And many of us may lie in the middle quantiles. That have to be very dangerous. This is very dangerous. I'm trying to get out of the room alive. But is it right that the people in the middle quantile are getting their incomes augmented by 16%? Should they not be paying higher levels of tax? I do think about that a lot. It doesn't seem to me we've got this quite right. So where have we ended up? Well, we ended up in a world in which the government is just getting larger. Now accounts for nearly 45% of expenditure in our economy. This is some of the highest numbers we've seen in the post-war period. There was a blip in 74-75 with the oil crisis there. But you can see a steady ratcheting up this century of total managed expenditure over time. Some wish to try and control it in 2010 with some fiscal consolidation. But what we have for the rest of this Parliament are continued levels of total managed expenditure far in excess of total receipts, so revenues raised, which means they're continuing to run deficits and preventing the level of public debt to GDP falling. And this leaves us vulnerable. On the margin, we don't sell our debt domestically. We sell it to overseas holders of our debt, which then makes us vulnerable to those economic shocks that I was talking about, and things that may make them less likely to want to hold debt. If they're less likely to want to hold debt, price of debt falls, the interest rate rises, and we have to pay even more in interest, making it harder to fund the National Health Service and all the things that really matter. So unfortunately, we're in a world in which we have to adopt some form of fiscal consolidation and ask our policymakers, what are you going to do to reduce the size of the government so we can reduce the size of debt? It's not a free good. One of the reasons we've had so much debt, it's been incredibly cheap. Interest rates have been low for a generation, so governments have felt they've been able to take on as much debt as they wish. And this is what we see. The green line here is public sector net debt. You can see it climbing to 100% for the numbers that I talked about earlier on. And you see it ratcheting up after the financial crisis, and again after during the Brexit wars, and again during COVID, and little or no chance of it falling far below 100% this decade. The blue bars tell you how much we're borrowing year on year. Look to the left-hand side, so 10% was a peak prior to COVID. COVID, we had 15% borrowing during the COVID years. But I want to note is unlike the fiscal consolidations that we had after World War II, World War I, or the Napoleonic Wars. Yes, I remember these things, I've studied them. We've continued to have deficits. No government has decided to move towards a balanced budget that would then bring down the level of debt. Now, whether that's a change in the political landscape or the demands of the population or weak government, I leave you to draw your conclusion. Of course, I think it's the third. That's my point about bank rate. Just drawing here, Bank of England's policy rate from 73, and our period is 1990. So you see, for a large part of this period, bank rate was above the inflation rate, meaning that short-term savers were given a real positive rate of return. But the unusual period after the financial crisis is that bank rate was far below the inflation rate, making it very hard for savers to get a real rate of return. And the increase in bank rate that we saw following the inflation of 21-22 was really nothing more than a normalization of bank rate, going back to something normal. And that's why I argue that the 3 3/4 rate that we currently got at the moment is not tight at all by any standards. And I'm pleased the bank did not cut rates today, to be honest. Inflation, I don't think there's a lot of time for me to talk about inflation, but I guess I'm simply making the point that apart from the period after COVID, when there's a combination of loose monetary and fiscal policy and a lack of commitment, it seemed to me, in 21-22 from the Bank of England to control inflation, we saw inflation going to double digits. It's by and large been a period of price stability for the British economy over this period. I'm going to just speed up a bit because I want to get there. And what we saw in the period of low interest rates was the Bank of England adopted a policy of quantitative easing. And what it did over this period was borrow from itself central bank reserves on which it paid bank rate. So that bank rate that we saw was at 0. That's what it was paying on the reserves. And it used those to buy bonds. Buying bonds from the private sector and holding them at the Bank of England, the asset purchase facility, took them out of the private sector and raised their prices. And what you can see, I think, is that there was a strategy to contain that until about 2020. But with interest rates very low, the QE program was reignited. Even more bonds were bought. But because at that time interest rates were low, they were bought on a very expensive basis. And they're being sold back at a great loss. There's probably not the time for me to go into QE. I'll be happy to take questions on it later on. But the likely cost of this program, the purchase and selling of bonds, is likely to cost the Exchequer some £100 billion, 3 to 4% of GDP. It's just not talked about. Given our tight fiscal position, I think it's something that should be talked about more. And it's certainly in the realm of a blunder. So what's our economic arc? Well, regular economic crises with volatility in outcomes. And we know these volatilities particularly affect those in the lower income brackets who are living hand to mouth, who haven't got access to savings and don't have wealth at their disposal in order to cushion the impact of income shocks. So as a welfare proposition, it's particularly damaging to these people. And we need to remember that they're placed in the regions around the country. So it's therefore not surprising for those of you who travel around the country to perceive a level of anger with some of the economic outcomes we see. There is a progressive tax and benefit system. I would question whether it's optimal. I don't think it is. Our government expenditure has been persistently in excess of revenues, which has driven up debt and debt interest. The fiscal framework that we have has failed. It hasn't controlled the level of debt and hasn't got us into a situation where we think it's going to be stabilised in the future. And I think that's a genuine problem. What it means is our long-term interest rates are very sensitive to shocks. Our long-term interest rates have gone up more than our trading partners following the problems in the Gulf recently. And if we have high levels of debt and indebtedness and a danger that fiscal sustainability may not obtain, it may even place an effective upper bound on bank rate and make it hard for the Bank of England to control inflation, at which point we really are in deep trouble as an economy. So our economic arc is one of economic fragility, a loss of economic confidence, and relative decline. At the same time, what we have, this is a measure of public sector worth, green line of assets, blue line are liabilities. And what we can see is that almost on a secular trend since the financial crisis, our public sector net worth has been trending down. Why is that? Pension liabilities, the accumulation of debt, public debt that we've seen, and a lack of public investment, meaning we're not building up public assets at all in our economy. And so we've gone from an economy that had a reasonably healthy public sector net worth to one in which public sector net worth is negative and requires significant repair. But do we have a politician or a policymaker who will say it needs to be done? Do we have a policymaker or politician who will say it needs to be done, but it's going to take us a generation? We've got colleagues who estimate that the level of public capital that we have on our economy is something between 50 to 100% of GDP below where it ought to be. So even if you're building up at 5% a year, it's going to take 10 years or more to build that up, probably much longer given other shocks. That's where we sit with a large capital gap. In work that I've been doing with Charles Nolan at Glasgow, we're looking at the equilibrium that's obtained. This is probably not the time for me to go into this in detail, but we're looking, and it mirrors some of the work by one of my colleagues here, Humbak Lee, on the complementary possibilities of public investment and private investment. It turns out there are a lot of critical assumptions in order to get there. Public capital needs to be high skill, well delivered, needs to be limited leakage out of the country. You need an economy with slack in, not one that's working at full employment. And when you think hard about intangibles as well as the institutional delivery. But if we can manage these things in a consistent and credible manner, we may be able to move from our current bad equilibrium, which involves low growth, low interest rates and high public debt, to one in which we might have high growth, high interest rates and low public debt. I'm presenting the results of that paper on the 14th of May at Birkbeck on the state of the economy. If anybody wants to come down there for that, probably not, but I'll say it anyway. Now, I'll see if I can get through the rest of this in about 5 minutes, Charles. So, a lot of talk about the political system that we've got, and it's a bloody mess. The tenure of our prime ministers seems to be falling. I was hoping that Keir would still be in office when I gave this talk. I think he is. Is he? Is he still in? I don't know. I left the house an hour and a half ago. Anything might have happened. Anything might have happened by then. But, you know, we had a year of 3 prime ministers, didn't we? Johnson, Truss and Sunak. And Truss, of course, I shouldn't say this, managed to at least Granger cause the death of our Queen and destroy the economy by projecting unfunded expenditures of some 3% of GDP that would have triggered a large increase in interest rates that led to a huge gilt sell-off in September 2022. And therefore she had to leave office remarkably quickly. And what worries me is, you know, particularly thinking that today is the 50th anniversary of Wilson deciding the job was too much for him. And Wilson, of course, was an economist himself, had excelled in PPE Oxford, if that's possible, had excelled at PPE in Oxford, and worked as an economist throughout his career, but really felt that the task of running the British economy was just too hard, having won 4 elections out of 5. And it's not clear that we've had a great run of prime ministers since the financial crisis, and we could see that their tenure has been falling. I think this is a reflective, rather than causal, of some of the great problems the British economy is suffering from. It's been ever harder to run the economy. One of the advisors at Number 10 told me recently, he said if they thought it was this hard, they wouldn't have taken the job. And that's to which I did say, well, yeah, I'm not sure I asked you to take the job, but that's a discussion for another day. But they're clearly, Prime Minister after Prime Minister is finding it very hard to run the British economy because of the crises that we find ourselves in, because of our inability to plan in the future, meaning the crises are coming more often, and more damaging and more volatile, limiting the room for manoeuvre of policymakers. Can't always spend money every time there's a crisis. One day you'll find you haven't got any money left. We're not far off that situation. This is reflected in the views of people around the country. And I want to thank my friends at Ipsos for sending me this data. And also for the lower index, I want to thank Peter Kellner, who's a good friend of mine, who suggested this idea to me. And all the top chart does is the Ipsos have been running this survey since about the time Harold Wilson stepped down. And it's the balance of opinion on people who think the economy is going to get better and those who think it's going to get worse. And what we can see in our secular period, but these are not economists being asked, there's just 1,000 people in the survey, mirroring almost exactly the pattern of decline in the British economy. People's optimism matches the decline that we're seeing in the economy. So people are pretty smart. Don't let economists tell you otherwise. Don't let politicians tell you otherwise. Economists, we know people are smart. It's politicians who think everyone's dumb. But what was interesting to me as well was Peter Kellner's idea. He said, why don't you add up the net approval of the Prime Minister, those who think the Prime Minister is doing a good job, minus those who think the Prime Minister is doing a bad job, and add in those who think the Leader of the Opposition is doing a good job, minus those who think the Leader of the Opposition is doing a bad job, and add them together and call it a respect index. Peter's a smart chap, so I did it. And here's what I found, almost exactly the same story. That not only are we losing faith in the economy, we're losing faith in our politicians' ability to run affairs. We don't think a lot of them anymore. Maybe there was a time that we did. I mean, there are people like Dennis Healey and Nigel Lawson I thought were pretty good people. I hope that's not offending anyone. I thought they were excellent. But I'm not sure, by and large, that people think our current leaders are all that good. And this is the respect index that I'm projecting to support that view. So what are our blunders? Well, I've said a number of times, we seem to head towards crisis rather than risk management as an economy. It's what we do well. For those of you who like reading, I do, so I would do it all the time if people let me. Susan Hayward's biography of Jeremy Hayward is quite excellent on how we do crisis management. Everyone will think, we don't know what to do, we'll ask Jeremy. Wonderful book about her dearly departed husband. William Keegan is excellent on 9 Crises as well. I think he's 93 or 94 now, but he's still definitely worth reading. And my friend Will Hutton is also thinking hard about how we might do better. So 3 things for you to read. I hope they're all in the reading list. I think Suzanne Hayward's book was knocked off. I'll try and refresh my reading list to put that back in. But what we have are politicians who are thinking about short-termism and headline grabbing. There's a problem, let's spend a bit of money, there's a solution. It's not a solution. There are much deeper things that have to be thought about here. We have a failure to address secular trends. Why are we not addressing these matters? Our polarized society masks average decline. If you're lucky enough to have gone to Cambridge, you're lucky enough to have got yourself a good job, you're not going to see all the problems in the economy, to be honest, as you go on your 3 or 4 holidays a year, wherever you might go to. But the rest of us see these things and worry about them desperately. I think it's very important that we address the problems of a polarized society. And I think my fundamental issue is there's just a lack of ownership of our economic policy. Who is responsible? Well, how can chancellors be responsible when they're only in post for a year and a half or 2? Do we know at the Treasury who's responsible? Has anyone got an idea who's responsible? Is anyone responsible, or are we all responsible? We have to have some people we can point to and say, can you do a better job? But what we get when we talk to our policymakers is to blame everyone else. Nothing can be done, they say. It's just like other OECD economies. Really? I just don't believe that. It's not good enough. As I said right at the beginning, with many, many smart people in this country, with some quite brilliant institutions, and with reform, I feel we can definitely do better. Now, there's a phrase in economics, at the risk of causing more people to leave the room, about it taking a whole heap of Harburger triangles to make an Oaken gap. And what that means is, when you think about output gaps in the economy, when you think about a depression, that output is below its potential. That's a big number, 4, 5, 6% of GDP. But in order to get there, it's a result of a lot of inefficiencies in a lot of small markets. When you add up all those efficiencies, you end up with that 5, 6% of GDP. So my deeper point is, Yes, we can look at the aggregate numbers, and that's what I do for a living. Boring though it is, I still enjoy it. But that is the counterpart of a large number of failures of public administration. I just listed, this page could go on for several pages. I'm not even going to read them all out. We've had so many failures of public administration since 1990. It's a national scandal and disgrace. If I could pick one, for example, why don't we just give the post office submasters their money? Why are they waiting? And this is what we have. Oh, we'll wait for the process to see itself through. I'm afraid during that process, people are dying. It's simply not good enough. And we have this time and time again. I probably shouldn't talk about Epstein, but it makes me sick to the stomach. The whole matter and the way it's been dealt with, and the way so many people have turned a blind eye to that guy's behavior. So what are the answers? Well, there's no silver bullet. What we need to realize is that investment is the key, whether it's tangible or intangible investment. We need to recognize as an economy, we just don't invest enough in the future. It's our statement about where we're going to think we're going in the future. We invest a very low share of our output compared to our trading partners. I want to thank Issam, my dear former student, who's living the life of Riley in Morocco now, having just won the African Nations Cups. He's ringing me up, telling me what a great victory it was. In response to him, I said, can Leeds United please have the 1975 European Cup back? He hasn't got a clue what I'm talking about. I'm so glad some of you do. But there's no investment. Lack of confidence, regional imbalances, domestic finance I've already talked about, poor infrastructure. There's a lot of issues that have to be sorted out before we can increase investment. It cannot be done by diktat. It cannot be done by word of mouth. It has to be done as a fundamental structural reform of our economy. Part of it will be public investment. If we split up investment to public and private, there were debates a generation ago, Charles and I will remember them well. It's about, doesn't public investment crowd out private investment? Well, rubbish. Under the right circumstances, it will provide complementary support for private investment. What you need is well-targeted public investment with appropriate guardrails. It has to be consistent, credible, and a commitment to produce public investment at scale that will bid in private investment in the country. You only have to look at the disaster of HS2 to see how we manage public investment in this country. Nobody still knows what's going to happen and when, and we spent an absolute fortune on it. Heads should roll, but they won't. They'll get themselves a nice non-executive director's post somewhere or other, running yet another bank, no doubt. God, I'm sounding very left-wing today, I'm sorry. Charles, got to be your fault. And I'm going to leave you with one quote, if I may. And I'm not going to read it out because I start to well up. But this is why policy matters. Good policy can prevent bad outcomes and provide succor for those people who need the best support. I do a bit of social media, and most of my social media is about monetary policy. So I may get 1 like and 3 retweets, maybe 8 people might read it. That's my median. I saw this by James Butler about a year and a half ago in the London Review of Books, and I just stopped dead where I was. I thought, this is absolutely right. So I retweeted it. 250,000 people looked at that. And that tells you about how important policy is to get right. Every death was the result of choices, acts of negligence, carelessness, contempt, incompetence, and deliberate deceit made by individuals, corporations, and elected officials. I can't think of a more damning statement about the quality of British public life and administration than this paragraph by James Butler. But I want you to bear in mind that this is just one example of many, and it's very much why we have the economic problems that we have. We're just not collectively doing a good enough job. I want to thank you all for listening to my rant this evening, which I apologise for. I wish you all peace and love. And also I want to wish you a joyful and happy Nowruz, Persian New Year, tomorrow afternoon. Thank you very much.
Well, what a fantastic talk. Thank you, Jagjit, very, very much indeed. I wouldn't characterise it as a rant, actually, though it had one or two rant elements in it. Rantish. Yeah. I'm going to throw it open to the floor in a moment, but a couple of points that I'd like to kick off, first of all. You listed a long range of bad decisions. Of all the ones in this period, 1990 to 2026, what would you identify as the worst decision? You talked about the ERM, you talked about Brexit, you talked about COVID and decisions in that area. You've talked much more structurally as well. But is there a particular decision which you would identify more than any others as an illustration of the argument you're trying to make?
I think, Charles, it's a very good question, as ever. I expect nothing else. I think we were so scarred by the financial crisis and the concern that British debt would be impossible to sell, that we adopted a hair-shirt response to the position of the economy at exactly the time when it was possible to raise money extremely cheaply. And the signal being sent by global low interest rates was for the public sector to invest. And we missed an opportunity from 2010 through to 2016 to invest heavily in our public infrastructure, to build up public assets, to sort out many of the supply constraints that we're currently facing, because we were under the spell of fiscal rectitude. Now, let me be clear. I'm absolutely in favour of sound money. No problem. I don't want us to run up debts that we cannot pay. But the signal being sent by low interest rates was, that's the time to invest. And what we had, I mean, it's remarkable. I've talked about this in a paper I published at the end of last year. The Treasury at the time was more likely to listen to someone coming over from the States, in this case, Ken Rogoff, who, in many respects, I have a great deal of time for. But like many Americans, I love many Americans dearly, knows very little about Britain. And took
you don't include Donald Trump in that?
Donald Trump? No. I feel unwell. And there was some work going around saying if debt got over 90% of GDP, it was a problem. But it was used as a hard and fast rule that persuaded the Treasury, or was used by the Treasury, to try and bring about a hair-shirt approach to public policy. When really any sensible analysis of the British economy at the time would have said, actually, our public assets need rebuilding, they need investment, and this is the time that we need to invest in the economy. And it was a mistaken policy that we still haven't reversed yet. And I would say that's the critical error we made.
Very interesting. It's not the answer I expected, actually.
Tell me later.
Now, you've talked a lot about politics, obviously. You started out with the ERM and Brexit, and you even went so daring as to mention Liz Truss and those decisions. Some countries decided they would try and move towards a more technocratic prime minister. There are some countries that said, let's get rid of the politicians. There are lots of reasons you gave, the problem of long-term versus short-term and so on. Technocratic, you could say the independence of the Bank of England, which the new Labour government brought in 1997, was moving towards a more technocratic rather than a political approach. Do you believe that is the right way forward? Do you believe politics is so flawed for a variety of different reasons? You've got to bring technocratically competent people into decision-making roles in different ways, or do you think politics can resolve these things?
I believe in representative democracy. That's not an issue. I think one of the problems I have looking at the way we formulate economic policy is that it tends to arrive fully formed. The Treasury go off into a huddle and say, this is what we're going to do. We don't have sufficient discussion in public about our options. So we don't tend to enter into debates that will lead to better outcomes in the end.
And do you blame politicians for that, or universities, or businessmen trying to secure their money? Well, by what process do you think you could get, I completely agree with you actually, but by what process do you think we could move to a better public debate about the kinds of issues you're talking about?
Well, we clearly need a situation where policymakers in Whitehall are more open to discussion about options than they currently are. The alternative is that they're just lobbied by people behind closed doors, which is not in any way an optimum way ahead. We need more discussion, more white papers about the options that might be faced, and a serious approach to the development of an economic or advisory council about what might happen. Our current economic council, I think, is a couple of special economic advisors and one part-time professor. It's not a serious set of people assessing the quality of economic policy. I'm very pleased with the recent appointment of the government's chief economic advisor, but I just don't think there's enough expertise. And the Treasury and many parts of Whitehall have been hollowed out. They've lost a lot of expertise over many years, and there's been a lost collective memory about how you deal with issues and how you end up with better forms of policy. There's been too much reliance on consultants to shore up a gap. And the problem with consultants, I apologize to anyone who works in the area of consultancy, I don't mean it personally in any way, but there's a danger that you don't own what you're saying. You're just passing on advice and then you're out of the door, off on your next holiday or skiing trip. Rather than...
I thought you were the expert on skiing.
Well, I used to be. I pay for it myself, always, to be clear. Yeah. But it's very important that we have ownership of policy, that people see these things through. And I think in a more fixed civil service, that's what used to happen. There's a lot of churn in the civil service, a lot of loss of institutional memory.
Thank you very much. Now, I throw it open to comment. Thank you. Okay, over to you.
Some excellent questions. There is a problem in the UK economy. It's become too complex and it's getting very hard to do things. So we need some way of cutting through what used to be called red tape, bureaucracy. It's just incredibly hard. I'm not going to argue against building regulations. What I'm arguing here about is what was a very poor response to the problems at Grenfell, and subsequently to helping the poor people who lost their livelihoods. Now, how you make buildings safer is clearly something that needs to be addressed, and there's the cladding issue that is affecting many people who own houses around London as well. I haven't got any quick answers for you on that, but I think handling extra regulation and bureaucracy is a genuine problem facing the economy, and we need to do what we can to speed up those matters so that building can occur and we can crack on and build better homes for people. I think it's something that we shouldn't ignore. Now, whether we have, Chris is asking whether we should have individuals or corporations responsible. I think it's a good idea to make individuals responsible for what they're doing, whether it's a police officer who's investigating the murder of a young man at a bus stop, or the negligent behaviour of CEOs in running quasi-public bodies. I think people should feel personally responsible for the actions that they take rather than hiding behind corporations. You might be asking because you've got a view on that yourself, but it strikes me as a pretty good way of getting people in order. I remember when I became director of the National Institute that I knew my neck was on the block. If the Institute failed, there wasn't anyone else they were going to point at. There was no point in me saying, well, as our politicians do, it was in a pretty bad state when I got here. People say, well, no, you're in charge now. It's all your fault. And I think that does exercise the mind quite keenly. So yes, I would go for that unless someone could tell me that that's a bad idea. Leighton, which asked like a true social democrat in Europe, which countries do I look up to? Well, not America. Let me just put that on it, make it clear. I think there are elements in many countries that we could draw upon, whether it's the infrastructure development that we've seen in the Far East, the robust democracies that we see in Scandinavia, the movement towards eradicating inequality that we see in Nordic countries, the love of culture and literature that we see in France. I wouldn't necessarily point to any one country as the one that I'd want to ape, but let's see if what we can find is best in a number of countries and move towards there. I don't have this idea that we should just see what's done in another country and copy it. I think we can develop our own approach, which is throwing a historical spanner into this, which is what we did in the 18th century, is what we did after the Napoleonic Wars, and what we did after World War II. Try to find the best and move ahead on that basis. I could see positive things in many countries. And I can see some positive things in this country as well, just that we're not harnessing it very well at the moment.
The example that was tried by the last Labour government on responsibility was to introduce the idea of corporate manslaughter in law. And it was the idea that the corporations, including the individuals, would be held to account for terrible things that happened. I'm not sure, looking back, whether that really has made much of a difference in all this area, but there was an effort to try and answer your question. Next round of three. Okay, three good further questions, Jagjit, to stretch you a bit.
Excellent questions. I mean, we talk about Gulf economies, they're resource rich, so they've got very high levels of government net worth when they're not being attacked by missiles left, right and centre. So good luck to them. We're in a different situation as a trading nation, and we have to sort of think on our feet and think nimbly about how we're going to perform. And we create our value added by selling services, human capital services to the rest of the world, either in finance or in consultancy or in accountancy or in other areas, and hope that generates sufficient demand to provide people with higher wages in the economy. That's our essential economic model. So we have to think about how we do that better. How can we make it easier to train the people that we need to stay here and carry out their jobs, and create areas of local demand around the country so that people who don't want to work as accountants or in finance can also find high-paying jobs. That's a very different model to the one of the Gulf, which is producing primary goods and relying on tourism. It's not for me. It's not what I want to do. So, once we decide that's the way we want to go, we need to decide how to facilitate that across the country. And that does require, it seems to me, thought about research and development, investment across the country, and I would say there's nice support for our universities wherever they are around the place. And certainly rethinking the student loan fiasco, which I'm sure we could talk about another time. The question about degrowth comes up quite a lot. I think I don't want to get into growth or degrowth, but I think we want people to feel materially better off over their lifetime, however we want to define that. Now, the way we tend to measure it is in terms of the production of goods and services. And that might also include their life expectancy, the level of health they've got over their lifetime, and the quality of their life. So a number of other indicators that might matter to us. We also know when we study these things, they're pretty well related to the income that's generated in an economy. So, my answer may not satisfy you completely, but if we want a broader set of people to be happier with the lives that they have, we want the economy to generate higher levels of income so they can satisfy their basic needs, which doesn't mean a new iPhone every other week. It means having sufficient space to live in, having enough income so you can take appropriate leisure time, not feeling stressed at work and worrying about bills, and being able to afford your utility bills in a particular way. That's the way I'd sort of think about where we want the economy to be going. And if that requires some element of economic growth, so be it. That doesn't worry me particularly. I hope that answer helps to some degree. Now, universal basic. Yes, universal basic. We've had this hoary old chestnut thrown at us a lot. I would much rather think of targeted income for people who cannot support themselves, even though they're trying to go to work, rather than universal basic income. I think it would be an unnecessary and very expensive way to proceed. I've written on this, and I just, when you add up the numbers, there are surely better ways of providing support for those people who are destitute and living on the poverty line, however defined, than a universal basic income. We're already in a position where we have very high taxes. The government is large. I'm fundamentally concerned about the size of the government that we have. When governments take powers, forgive me, Charles, they don't give them back. They keep them. And we see that time and time again. My favourite here is, say, income tax was introduced in 1799 by William the Pitt on a temporary basis. We've still got it. And that's the problem with governments to some degree. When they grab a power, they don't give it back again. So I prefer we think of mechanisms by which the state would reduce in size rather than increase in size by giving people a permanent income. Now, you have every right to disagree with that. That's my view.
Okay, I'm going to take the last round of 3 before we come to Harvard. They're terrified of your answer, Jagjit.
No, don't be silly. Don't be silly.
We'll go straight to those 3, please.
Okay, so AI, there's a lot of, AI is very bubblicious. Everyone's going crazy about it at the moment. I think it'll take a long time before it really has a strong impact on jobs and the economy. There's some evidence to suggest that some people are finding it more difficult to find jobs as a result. I guess I'm a bit long in the tooth now. I've heard this before. Heard this before about the financial sector, heard it before about fintech. I think in the longer run, more new jobs will be created. And in the longer run, I don't think we're all going to be out of finding things to do. We'll always have things to do. AI facilitates. It might speed up the process. I don't even have ChatGPT. I know how to write. I don't need it. But I shouldn't say many of my colleagues. Many of my friends use it. And it's up to them. But I don't yet think it's necessary, and I certainly don't think it's sufficient. I'm also, so far, been able to tell when someone has sent me something that's been written by AI rather than themselves. So it will have an impact, but to the extent to which it facilitates change will be very helpful. And I think to all of you younger in the audience, don't rely on it. Train your own brain to read and think and write. Once you stop doing that, and I can tell you from someone who lost the ability to walk last year, you need to get up and walk. You need to get up and do it yourself in order to develop the muscle memory so you can do these things. So don't rely on it, I would say. Ignore it. Get on with your life. Now, Brexit, there's a lot of silly studies out there, so-called doppelganger studies, where people look at economies that didn't Brexit and those who did, and they come up with some very large numbers. The serious work that I've looked at says, look, if you trade less with countries that are rich and are near you, you will affect productivity negatively and investment negatively and employment prospects negatively. But it's on a slow burn basis. It's not something that immediately leads to a large hit. So I think some work recently had a lot of attention because it was suggesting like an 8% hit. In fact, I think our dear Chancellor referred to it on Tuesday in the May's lecture. There's nothing like an 8% immediate hit from Brexit. What we talk about, and I'm sorry to use this jargon, we're talking about moving from one steady state to another. So something in which the economy will converge in 30 to 40 years' time, maybe 5 to 6 or 7% lower than it would otherwise, but it will be imperceptibly difficult to measure that over a 50-year period, because you're about 0.1 or 0.2% year by year is the reduction you're going to see. So think of it as a slow burning effect rather than something that is this large hit that people have completely misunderstood what the nature of those studies are. But going back to your point, what really damaged us was that huge period of uncertainty. Are we going to leave? Under what conditions are we going to leave? Who the hell's going to be our prime minister tomorrow? These were the things that were causing high levels of uncertainty during the Brexit wars. And it's clear that directly affected business investment at the time. And the extent to which it affected business investment affected employment and economic growth over that period. But in a sense, that's not Brexit per se. That's because our heads were in a spin and we didn't know what was going to happen. And we didn't have a set of prime ministers who were managing the process very well at all. I hope that answers your question. On public debt, there is a strategy. And the strategy has got to be to think hard about which taxes you can raise. I've hinted at things that you might do to people in the middle income level. You might want to broaden the scope of VAT. There are certain things you could do to raise revenues somewhat, but I don't particularly want to see revenues heading much north of 40%. Once that was established as a strategy, and you might want to have a royal inquiry of some sort that would think about a move towards a more optimal tax system. Then say, look, what we're going to try and do is issue bonds that are directed at capital investment, that maybe are even managed by an investment bank, a national investment bank at scale. Our current investment bank might account for 1% of GDP by the end of this decade. That's tiny, it's not large enough. So an investment bank at scale, 10, 15, 20% of GDP, that was appropriately managed, that would give the financial markets comfort that it was going to invest in the right places and produce appropriately high economic returns so the debt would be paid off, would not necessarily scare the horses. So that's the kind of strategy. One level, increased taxes where required. On the other level, think very carefully about how you introduce higher levels of public investment, ideally through the adoption or invention of a proper investment bank that would manage those public investments.
Jagjit, we've come to the end of our time. I just want, firstly, to thank you very, very much for both this lecture and your work, but what you've put in over your economic life. It's been tremendous. Thank you very, very much indeed.